"You look as though you have forgotten what music is for, Your Grace." The words were quiet, almost gentle, yet they carried farther through the Ashford ballroom than Emily Carter intended, perhaps because the room had already begun to fall silent around her. Beneath 3 glittering chandeliers, nearly 200 guests stood amid candlelight, polished marble, black coats, and gowns that shimmered like winter roses, but Emily noticed none of them now. Her attention rested entirely on the tall man before her. William Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had spent most of the evening beside the tall western windows, dressed in severe black, his steel-gray eyes fixed somewhere beyond the glass as snow drifted across the dark gardens. Every unmarried woman in the county knew his name. Every ambitious mother knew the size of his estate. Yet no woman had danced with him in 6 years. Emily knew only the rumor, not the reason. A moment earlier, Lady Margaret Whitmore had glanced at Emily's modest blue gown and remarked loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear that companionship to an elderly widow did not make one suitable company for dukes. Emily had answered with silence. She had endured worse things than laughter. Poverty had taught her that dignity was easiest to lose when one tried too desperately to defend it. So instead of retreating toward Mrs. Abigail Munro's chair at the edge of the ballroom, Emily had crossed the polished floor. Now she stood before the most intimidating man in the room with one gloved hand extended. William looked first at her face, then at her hand. His expression revealed nothing. "And what do you believe music is for, Miss Carter?" His voice was low and controlled. Emily could feel the attention of the room pressing against her back. "Sometimes," she said, "to remind us that we are still alive." Something changed in his eyes. Not warmth. Not yet. But the perfect stillness of his face cracked for the briefest second, as though her answer had reached a locked room inside him. Somewhere behind Emily, a woman whispered her name. Another guest gave a nervous laugh. Lady Margaret's jeweled fan stopped moving altogether. William glanced toward the orchestra, where the musicians had continued playing with remarkable discipline despite the spectacle unfolding before them. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace." "Then you know I do not dance." Emily lowered her hand slightly, but she did not retreat. "I know people say you do not." His brow lifted. "There is a difference. A considerable one." For the first time that evening, William Ashford looked almost amused. "Almost. You are either remarkably courageous, Miss Carter, or remarkably foolish. Those qualities are often confused at parties." A faint sound escaped him, so small Emily might have imagined it. But Thomas Reed, the Duke's elderly steward standing near the doors, suddenly looked toward his master with astonishment. William's gaze returned to Emily's hand. 6 years of silence seemed to gather between them. Then, slowly, he removed one black glove and placed his hand in hers. The ballroom seemed to forget how to breathe. Emily felt the warmth of his fingers through her glove as he led her toward the center of the floor. Couples moved aside without being asked. Whispers followed them like wine through dry leaves. William stopped beneath the central chandelier and faced her with the formal distance propriety demanded. "One dance," he said. "One dance," Emily agreed. The orchestra shifted smoothly into a waltz. William's hand settled carefully at the proper place near her shoulder blade, while hers rested lightly against his arm. His first steps were rigid, controlled, almost mechanical. Emily followed without comment. Around them, silk rustled and candle flames trembled in the drafts from the high windows. "You may breathe, Your Grace," she murmured. His eyes narrowed. "I was under the impression I already was. Not properly." And then it happened. The corner of the Duke's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but near enough that Emily nearly missed her next step. William steadied her without effort. For several turns across the floor, the whispers disappeared. There was only music, candlelight, and the strange realization that beneath the title, beneath the coldness, beneath 6 years of whatever sorrow had silenced him, there was still a man who remembered exactly how to dance. Then the orchestra changed melodies. William froze. The color vanished from his face. His hand fell away from Emily as though the music itself had burned him. Across the ballroom, Thomas Reed closed his eyes. William stared toward the musicians, and when he spoke, his voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "Stop." The orchestra faltered into silence. Without another word, the Duke turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Emily alone beneath the chandeliers while 200 stunned guests watched her and wondered what she had awakened. By midnight, the ballroom had emptied, but the silence William Ashford carried with him remained louder than the music ever had. He stood alone in the darkened library with one hand resting against the carved mantel, staring into a fire that had burned low enough to leave only a dull orange glow across the room. 6 years. That was how long it had been since he had heard that waltz played beneath his own roof. 6 years since he had ordered the sheet music removed from every music room at Ashford Hall. 6 years since servants had learned never to hum the melody within his hearing. 6 years since he had allowed grief to turn one song into a locked door. Yet tonight, a young woman in a modest blue gown had opened it without even knowing it existed. William closed his eyes, and the ballroom vanished. In its place came another winter evening, another chandelier, another woman laughing as she turned beneath the same music. Eleanor Hayes had been 27 then, bright-eyed and impatient with formality, forever accusing William of treating every dance as if it were a military exercise. "You count the steps too carefully," she had told him once. One day, "William, you must learn to simply hear the music." He had promised her he would try. He had promised her many things. The last promise had been that he would meet her the following morning after a private supper at her brother's estate. She had never arrived. Her carriage overturned on the road before dawn, and the message reached Ashford Hall before breakfast. William had spent every year since then convinced that if he had not insisted she travel home that night, she would still be alive. Rational men had told him otherwise. Roads failed. Horses startled. Winter changed plans without apology. William listened to all of them and believed none of them. Guilt, he had discovered, did not require evidence. It required only memory. A quiet knock sounded at the library door. Thomas Reed entered carrying a silver tray, though William had not requested anything. "Leave it," William said. Thomas did not move. "You frightened the guests tonight, Your Grace. Then perhaps they will be less eager to return. That has never stopped them before." William glanced at him. Thomas had served the Ashford family for more than 30 years and had earned the dangerous privilege of speaking plainly. "You knew what the orchestra was playing." "Yes." "Why did you not stop them?" Thomas's face tightened. "Because you were dancing." The answer landed with irritating precision. William turned back toward the fire. "That was an error." "Was it?" Miss Carter did not know what she was asking. "Perhaps that is why you answered." William said nothing. He remembered Emily's expression when he had released her hand. There had been surprise in it, certainly, but not humiliation, not anger. She had simply watched him leave with those steady gray-blue eyes, as though she were trying to understand rather than judge. That unsettled him more than pity would have. The next morning, Emily Carter sat beside Mrs. Abigail Monroe in the breakfast room, pouring tea while pretending not to notice the glances traveling toward her from every corner. Lady Margaret Whitmore had already informed 3 guests, in a voice carefully designed to be overheard, that boldness was becoming terribly fashionable among women without family connections. Emily kept her attention on the teapot. "You are remarkably calm," Mrs. Monroe murmured. "I have discovered that people lose interest when one refuses to perform distress for them." Mrs. Monroe smiled into her cup. Across the room, William entered. Conversation softened immediately. He greeted the table with formal courtesy, then took his usual place at the far end. For several minutes, he did not look at Emily. Then she felt it. His gaze lifted. Their eyes met across nearly 30 feet of polished table and silver. Emily expected coldness. Instead, she saw something far more dangerous. Recognition. William looked away first. It was a small thing. No one else noticed. But Emily did. And for the first time since he had abandoned her beneath the chandeliers, she wondered whether the dance had shaken him because of something she had done, or because for one brief moment he had remembered what it felt like to be alive. Emily Carter had learned long ago that the easiest way to survive a room full of people who believed themselves superior was to give them nothing to punish. No trembling hands, no lowered eyes, no hurried excuses. She had been 17 when her father died, leaving behind a small house, a shelf of worn books, and debts that swallowed nearly everything else. He had been a schoolteacher in a quiet Massachusetts town before returning with his family to England to care for an ailing brother, a practical man who believed education mattered more than pedigree and character more than wealth. Emily had believed him. Society had not. By 24, she had become companion to Mrs. Abigail Monroe, a wealthy American widow who had settled in London after her husband died and who possessed the rare habit of judging people by the way they treated servants rather than by the names printed on their invitations. That employment had saved Emily from dependence, but it had not granted her position. At Ashford Hall, she remained what she had always been in grand houses: present, useful, and easily overlooked. That morning, after breakfast, she carried Mrs. Monroe's correspondence into the south sitting room and found one of the young footmen kneeling beside a fallen tray. A silver pot had rolled beneath a table, tea darkened the carpet, and a cup lay broken near the hearth. Lady Margaret Whitmore stood nearby with two other guests, her expression sharpened by inconvenience. "Must the staff here be so careless?" she said. The footman, barely older than 19, turned pale. "I am sorry, my lady." Emily set down the letters and crouched to help gather the unbroken pieces. "Leave that," Lady Margaret said. Emily looked up. "He has only 2 hands." The room went still for the smallest instant. Lady Margaret smiled without warmth. "And you seem determined to make yourself useful wherever you go." "It is a habit my father encouraged." Emily handed the silver pot back to the footman. He considered usefulness preferable to ornament. Mrs. Monroe, seated near the window, hid a smile behind her newspaper. What Emily did not see was William Ashford standing in the doorway. He had entered without announcement and remained there long enough to watch the footman regain his composure. His eyes moved from the spilled tea to Emily, then to Lady Margaret, who immediately transformed her expression into something gracious. "Your Grace," she said, "we were just discussing last evening." William stepped into the room. "Were you?" Emily rose. She expected him to look through her as he had done with so many others at breakfast. Instead, his gaze settled on the small stain of tea at the edge of her glove. "Miss Carter." "Your Grace." Lady Margaret opened her fan. "I fear your guest has unusual ideas about station." William looked at Emily. "So it would appear." The words were neutral, but something beneath them made Lady Margaret hesitate. William turned to the footman. "See that the carpet is cleaned." "Nothing more." Relief passed across the young man's face. "Yes, Your Grace." William continued down the corridor, yet 10 minutes later, from the window of his study, he saw Emily crossing the snow-dusted courtyard with Mrs. Monroe. She wore the same simple blue coat she had arrived in, its cuffs carefully mended, and stopped to speak with a gardener carrying firewood. She smiled at something the old man said. Not the polished smile of a woman seeking favor. A real one. William remained at the window longer than he intended. Thomas Reed entered quietly behind him. "The estate accounts, Your Grace." William did not turn. "Who is Miss Carter?" Thomas paused. "Mrs. Monroe's companion. I know what she does." Thomas followed his gaze toward the courtyard. "Her father was a teacher. She has no fortune worth mentioning. No important connections. Nothing society would consider remarkable." William watched Emily bend to retrieve a dropped mitten for Mrs. Monroe. "Society," he said softly, "has always been particularly gifted at overlooking the remarkable." That evening, William found himself standing outside the ballroom before he had consciously decided to go there. The great double doors remained open after the previous night's gathering, revealing a vast room stripped of its guests and strangely transformed by their absence. Daylight had once made the chandeliers glitter like ice. Now only a handful of candles burned along the walls, their small flames reflected across the polished floor. William stepped inside. His footsteps echoed beneath the high ceiling. 6 years ago, he had crossed this same floor with Eleanor Hayes while an orchestra played and winter rain whispered against the windows. Eleanor had laughed whenever he became too serious. She had possessed the uncommon ability to make formality seem ridiculous without ever making kindness seem weak. On their final evening together, she had worn ivory silk and a narrow blue ribbon at her wrist. William remembered both details with painful clarity. He remembered the waltz. He remembered her hand resting lightly in his. He remembered telling her that the weather was worsening and that she should leave before the roads became difficult. She had wanted to remain another hour. He had insisted. That single decision had followed him through every winter since. Her carriage never reached home. No accusation had ever been spoken against him. None was necessary. William had pronounced the sentence himself. From that morning forward, music had disappeared from Ashford Hall by degrees. First the waltz, then the winter balls, then almost every gathering that required laughter. The ballroom became an elegant tomb for a life he no longer believed belonged to him. Yet the previous night, Emily Carter had walked directly into that silence and held out her hand. Worse, he had taken it. William moved toward the center of the room and looked down at the exact place where she had stood. He could still hear her voice telling him to breathe. A faint rustle sounded near the doorway. Emily entered carrying a small book and stopped immediately when she saw him. "Your Grace, I did not realize anyone was here." William straightened. "Neither did I." Her brow furrowed slightly at the strange answer. "Mrs. Monroe left her book after the concert. I came to retrieve it." She spotted the volume on a chair near the wall and crossed toward it. William watched her carefully. "Miss Carter." She turned. "Yes. About last night." For the first time since meeting her, he saw uncertainty disturb her composure. "I owe you an apology if I caused offense." "You did not." Then embarrassment. "No." Emily studied him. "Pain." William's jaw tightened. That word entered too easily where others would have hesitated. "You ask unusually direct questions. Only when polite ones would be dishonest." He almost smiled, but the memory of the music extinguished it. The melody the orchestra played belonged to another time. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. "I understand. You cannot." "No," she said softly. "But I can understand that there are memories people protect because they fear what will happen if they touch them again." William looked at her more sharply. There was no curiosity in her expression, no hunger for gossip, only recognition. "And what do you do with such memories, Miss Carter?" She considered the question. "I suppose I try not to build my entire house around one locked room." The candle beside them flickered. William said nothing. Emily picked up Mrs. Monroe's book and walked toward the door, then paused. "For what it is worth, Your Grace, before the music changed, you were smiling." "I was not." "Almost." She left before he could answer. William remained alone beneath the chandeliers, staring at the empty doorway. Then, against his will, he remembered the dance differently. Not its ending. The moment before it. Emily missing one step. His hand steadying hers. Her quiet accusation that he had forgotten how to breathe. And something far more unsettling than grief moved through him. He wanted to hear her say something impossible again. The next morning, Emily returned to the ballroom alone. Mrs. Monroe had decided to spend the day resting after complaining of a headache, and the house had settled into the muted rhythm of winter, with servants moving quietly through long corridors and snow gathering along the lower edges of the tall windows. Emily told herself she had come only for the handkerchief she had misplaced the night before. She found it near the piano, folded beneath the leg of a chair where someone must have kicked it during the dance. As she bent to retrieve it, something pale caught her eye beneath the piano bench. A narrow strip of paper rested against the dark wood, yellowed at the edges and half hidden by dust. Emily hesitated. It was not hers. That should have been enough reason to leave it untouched. But when she saw the name written across the top in faded ink, her breath caught. "William." She picked up the paper carefully. Only a few lines remained legible. "If anything happens to me, William must know the carriage was not an accident." Emily read the sentence twice. Then a third time. The room seemed colder. She looked toward the ballroom doors, suddenly aware of how silent the house had become. The paper was torn from a larger letter. No signature remained, but Emily did not need one. Eleanor. The name had never been spoken directly to her, yet it hovered over Ashford Hall like perfume trapped in old curtains. Emily folded the fragment once and slipped it between the pages of Mrs. Monroe's book. She had no intention of keeping it. She only needed time to decide whether returning it would open a wound William had spent 6 years trying to close, or whether silence would be the greater cruelty. That decision followed her through the afternoon. At luncheon, William barely spoke. Lady Margaret filled the quiet with talk of London engagements and upcoming concerts. But Emily noticed that William's attention drifted whenever music was mentioned. Once, his gaze found hers. She looked away first. Later, while carrying a tray of correspondence to Mrs. Monroe's room, Emily passed Thomas Reed near the east staircase. "Mr. Reed," she said. He stopped. "Miss Carter." Emily lowered her voice. "Did Lady Eleanor ever write to His Grace shortly before she died?" Thomas's face changed so quickly that the answer became obvious before he spoke. "Why do you ask?" Emily chose her words carefully. "I found something in the ballroom." Thomas looked toward the corridor behind her. "You should give it to me." Was the carriage truly an accident? His expression closed. Some questions bring little comfort. That was not my question. Thomas studied her for a long moment. His Grace believes he was responsible because he encouraged her to leave that evening before the weather worsened. That is the truth he has lived with, but not necessarily the truth itself. Thomas said nothing. Emily felt the fragment inside the book against her arm. Before she could speak again, footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor. William appeared. His gaze moved from Thomas to Emily, then to the book in her hands. Something in his expression sharpened. "What are you discussing?" Thomas answered too quickly. "Household matters, Your Grace." William's eyes remained on Emily. Indeed, Emily could have remained silent. She could have handed the paper to Thomas later and allowed the mystery to disappear back into the walls. Instead, she opened the book and removed the folded fragment. William saw the handwriting before she said a word. The color left his face. "Where did you get that?" Emily held it carefully. "Behind the piano." He crossed the distance between them with controlled steps, but there was nothing calm in his eyes now. "Give it to me." She did. His fingers closed around the paper. He read the single surviving sentence. Once. Slowly. Then he looked at Thomas. "You knew about this." Thomas lowered his gaze. William's voice became quieter. "How much have you kept from me?" The corridor seemed to narrow around them. Emily understood then that she had not discovered a forgotten letter. She had opened a door someone had deliberately kept locked. William did not wait for an explanation in the corridor. He turned toward the library, the fragment of Eleanor's letter held between his fingers, and said only, "Both of you." Now, Thomas followed first. Emily came behind him, uncertain whether she had any place in what was about to happen, yet equally certain that leaving would feel like cowardice. The library doors closed with a heavy click. William crossed to the desk and placed the paper beneath the green-shaded lamp. "How much?" he asked. Thomas remained standing near the door. "Your Grace, how much have you kept from me?" His voice was quiet, which made the question more severe. Thomas drew a slow breath. There were concerns after Lady Eleanor's death. Nothing proven. Her brother believed someone had interfered with the carriage before she left his estate. William stared at him. "And no one thought to tell me? You were grieving. That was not your decision to make." "No, Your Grace." Emily watched something shift in William, not anger alone, but the sudden collapse of a certainty that had defined 6 years of his life. He picked up the fragment again. "Where is the rest of this letter?" Thomas hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. William's eyes hardened. "You have it." "Not here." "Where?" "Locked among Lady Eleanor's personal papers in the East Archive." William gave a humorless laugh. 6 years beneath my own roof." Thomas lowered his head. Her brother requested that certain documents remain sealed until there was enough evidence to understand them. He died before that happened. William turned away. Emily should have remained silent. "Instead," she said, "then perhaps they should be open now." William faced her so quickly that the air seemed to tighten. "This does not concern you, Miss Carter." "No, but the truth concerns you. You found one piece of paper and decided you understood 6 years of my life. I decided nothing. You questioned my steward. You carried private correspondence through my house. You stepped into matters that were never yours." Emily felt the words land, but she did not lower her gaze. "I found the letter by accident, and curiosity did the rest. Concern did." His expression changed. "Concern? Yes. You barely know me. That does not make suffering invisible." Silence followed. Thomas looked toward the floor. William moved to the window, where winter clouds pressed gray against the glass. "You had no right to open the dead," he said. Emily's voice softened. "Perhaps not." He turned. "Then we agree. But grief had no right to take 6 years from you either." Something in his face went still. Emily knew she had crossed the boundary now, but retreat would make the words dishonest. "You speak as though grief were a choice." "No, I speak as though living inside it forever might become one." William's hand tightened around the letter. "You know nothing about what I lost." "You are right." Her answer came without defense. "I did not know Lady Eleanor. I do not know what she meant to you. But I know what it is to lose someone and discover that the world continues without asking permission." William looked at her sharply. Emily thought of her father, of the small house sold after his death, of the morning she had packed her life into 2 trunks because there had been no money left for sentiment. "I also know," she continued, "that loving someone who is gone does not require becoming a ghost beside them." William's face closed. "Enough." Thomas stepped forward. Your Grace. Enough. William placed the fragment on the desk with deliberate care. When he looked at Emily again, the warmth she had glimpsed during their dance was gone. Mrs. Monroe's carriage can be prepared tomorrow morning. Emily understood immediately. He was asking her to leave. The realization hurt more than she expected, but she would not give the room the satisfaction of seeing it. She inclined her head. Very well. William seemed almost unsettled by her calm. Miss Carter. She paused at the door. For one dangerous second, she considered apologizing. Instead, she said, keep your ghosts if you must, Your Grace. But do not pretend they asked you to die with them. Then she left. William stood motionless after the door closed. Thomas said nothing. On the desk between them lay Eleanor's faded warning, and for the first time in 6 years, William found himself more afraid of the truth than of the memory. Long after Emily left the library, William remained beside the desk with Eleanor's torn letter before him and Thomas Reed standing in patient silence near the door. At last William said, "Bring me everything." Thomas understood. Nearly an hour later, he returned carrying a narrow wooden box darkened by age. William recognized it immediately. Eleanor's initials were carved into the lid. He had given her the box on her 25th birthday. For 6 years, he had believed it lost among her brother's possessions. His hand rested on the brass clasp, but did not open it. Why was this hidden, he asked. Thomas answered carefully. Because grief made every question dangerous, Your Grace. Her brother feared accusation without proof would destroy what remained of both families. William looked at him. And so everyone decided ignorance would be kinder. Thomas did not defend himself. William opened the box. Inside lay several folded letters, estate records, and a small blue ribbon. The sight of it nearly stopped him. Eleanor had worn one like it on the last night they danced. He set the ribbon aside and opened the first letter. Her handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, and slightly slanted. She wrote of discrepancies in the Ashford accounts, of payments authorized under the name of William's cousin, Lord Charles Ashford, and of her suspicion that Charles had been moving estate funds through false contracts. Another letter mentioned the carriage. Eleanor had discovered that its maintenance records had been altered after she asked questions about Charles. She had not written that he meant to harm her, only that she was frightened and intended to speak with William privately the following morning. William read faster, then slower. By the final page, his hands had begun to tremble. There was no confession blaming him, no suggestion that his insistence she leave early had caused what followed. Instead, Eleanor's final unsent letter ended with a sentence so simple that William had to read it twice. If I am gone before this is resolved, promise me one thing. Do not make grief the proof that you loved me. The room seemed to lose all sound. William lowered himself into the chair behind the desk. For 6 years, he had treated sorrow like a debt. Every silent dinner, every shuttered ballroom, every refused invitation had been another payment toward a guilt no one had asked him to carry. Thomas remained still. Charles, William finally asked. Gone abroad 5 years ago, Thomas said. The irregularities were quietly corrected after his departure. There was never enough evidence to establish more than fraud and negligence. William stared at Eleanor's words. It should have brought relief. Instead, relief arrived mixed with something almost unbearable. Waste. 6 winters. 6 springs. 6 years of choosing darkness because he had mistaken punishment for devotion. And then Emily's voice returned to him. Loving someone who is gone does not require becoming a ghost beside them. William closed his eyes. What time does Mrs. Monroe leave? Thomas hesitated. 8 tomorrow morning. William looked toward the window. Snow had begun falling again, soft against the black glass. And Miss Carter? With her. He should have felt satisfied. He had ordered it himself. Instead, the thought of Emily passing through Ashford's gates and becoming another absence in the house struck him with startling force. Your Grace? Thomas asked. William stood. Cancel the carriage. Thomas's eyebrows rose. Mrs. Monroe's as well. William almost answered yes, then stopped. Pride had governed enough of his life. No, that would be discourteous. He looked again at Eleanor's letter. Tell Mrs. Monroe the roads may be unsafe until noon. That much is true. Thomas understood more than William wished him to. And Miss Carter? William moved toward the door. I will speak to Miss Carter myself. Across the hall, Emily sat beside her packed trunk, folding her blue gown with careful hands. She had told herself leaving was sensible, necessary, final. Then someone knocked. She expected a maid. Instead, William Ashford stood beyond the door, pale from a sleepless night, Eleanor's letter in one hand, and something unfamiliar in his expression. Not command, not anger, humility. Emily did not invite him inside. She stood beside the half-packed trunk with one hand resting on the folded blue gown, while William remained at the threshold as though he understood that rank gave him no authority over this particular moment. For several seconds neither spoke. Morning light entered through the tall window behind her, pale and cold, touching the room without warming it. William held Eleanor's letter carefully. "You were right," he said at last. Emily had expected an apology, perhaps an explanation. She had not expected those words. "About which part?" she asked. Something almost weary passed across his face. Enough of it. He told her what he had found during the night. The altered estate records. Charles Ashford's hidden dealings. Eleanor's concern about the carriage. Most of all, he told her about the final sentence Eleanor had written. "Do not make grief the proof that you loved me." Emily listened without interrupting. When he finished, William looked toward the packed trunk. "I should not have spoken to you as I did." "No. And I should not have ordered you away." "No." His gaze returned to hers. "You make forgiveness remarkably difficult." Emily's expression softened, but only slightly. Forgiveness should not be confused with making consequences comfortable. For the first time since entering, William nearly smiled. "There it is again." "What?" "The impossible thing you say as though it were perfectly ordinary." He glanced down at Eleanor's letter. "Mrs. Monroe has agreed to delay her departure until noon because of the roads. I hoped you might remain longer." Emily was silent. "That is not an order," he added quickly. "I know. Nor gratitude." That made her look at him more closely. William seemed unsettled by the need to explain himself, as though honesty were a language he had once known and forgotten through lack of use. "Then what is it?" she asked. His answer came quietly. "A request." Emily did not stay. Not then. At noon, she left Ashford Hall with Mrs. Monroe, because dignity required that William learn the difference between wanting someone near and earning the right to ask them to remain. The winter passed. William wrote twice. Emily answered once. His letters contained no declarations, only small truths. He had reopened the East Music Room. Thomas had ordered the piano tuned. The tenant school had received new books. In early spring, Mrs. Monroe accepted an invitation to a charitable ball in London, and Emily accompanied her. The ballroom there was brighter than Ashford Hall, crowded with society families eager for fresh gossip. Emily wore a simple silver-gray gown. She had barely entered when Lady Margaret Whitmore approached. "Miss Carter," she said sweetly. "How fortunate that Mrs. Monroe still requires companionship. I had wondered whether your unusual visit to Ashford Hall had resulted in something more permanent." Emily recognized the trap and refused it. "Mrs. Monroe has always been generous to me." Lady Margaret lowered her voice, though not enough to prevent nearby guests from hearing. "Generosity is admirable. Ambition less so. A dance with a duke can encourage extraordinary fantasies." Several conversations quieted. Emily felt the familiar pressure of judgment gather around her. She lifted her chin. "Then it is fortunate I have always preferred reality." Lady Margaret's smile sharpened. "And what reality would that be?" Before Emily could answer, movement began at the opposite side of the ballroom. William Ashford had entered. He wore black, but not morning black. No one announced his intention. None was necessary. People stepped aside as he crossed the floor. Lady Margaret turned, confidence returning immediately. William passed her without stopping. He came directly to Emily. The room gradually fell silent. For a moment he simply looked at her, and Emily saw the difference winter had made. The sorrow remained, but it no longer owned every room behind his eyes. William extended his hand. "The first dance was yours to offer," he said. His voice carried just far enough. "May the second be mine?" Emily looked at his hand, then at his face. She did not take it. "Is this gratitude?" "No." "Pity." His expression hardened almost indignantly. "Never." The smallest murmur moved through the guests. Emily held his gaze. "Then what is it?" William seemed to forget that anyone else existed. "The beginning," he said, "if you will allow it." Only then did Emily place her hand in his. The orchestra began to play. Around them, whispers rose and died, but William did not look away from her once. By late April, Ashford Hall no longer seemed to be waiting for winter to return. The heavy curtains were opened each morning. Sunlight crossed rooms that had spent years in shadow, and the piano in the East Music Room was played often enough that no one lowered their voice when passing the door. William did not become a different man. He was still reserved, still careful with words, still more comfortable with estate ledgers than drawing room conversation. But the silence around him had changed. It was no longer a wall. Emily noticed the difference during her visits with Mrs. Monroe, which became frequent after William began supporting the small school near the Ashford tenants' cottages. New books arrived from Boston and New York, along with maps, writing slates, and several boxes of supplies Emily had suggested months earlier. William never mentioned that he remembered every detail she had once spoken about her father's belief in education. He simply made certain the school had what it needed. In May, Ashford Hall hosted its first spring gathering in 6 years. It was not a grand society ball. William refused that idea immediately. Instead, tenant families, local teachers, estate workers, and invited guests filled the gardens beneath strings of lanterns while children ran across the lawn and musicians played near the terrace. Thomas Reed stood at the entrance watching the unfamiliar sight with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Emily found William near the ballroom doors after sunset. Inside, candles glowed beneath the chandeliers, but the room was empty. "Avoiding your own gathering?" she asked. William glanced toward the gardens. "Temporarily. That sounds suspiciously like hiding. I prefer strategic withdrawal." Emily smiled. "Of course." He opened the ballroom door wider. "Walk with me." They crossed the polished floor together. No orchestra followed them. No society whispers. Only the distant sound of laughter from outside and the soft ticking of the old clock near the wall. William stopped beneath the chandelier where they had first danced. "Do you know when I fell in love with you?" he asked. Emily turned to him. The question was so unexpected that for once she had no immediate answer. "When I found Eleanor's letter?" "No. When I told you that grief had taken too much from you. That nearly made me send you across the county. You did send me away. A decision I have regretted with impressive consistency." She laughed softly. William watched her with a warmth that no longer disappeared the moment it appeared. Emily considered again. "When you saw me at the London ball?" "Earlier. Then I surrender." William looked toward the far end of the room, as though seeing another winter night layered over the present one. Everyone there wanted something from the Duke. A title, favor, attention, a story they could repeat afterward. His gaze returned to her. "You offered something to the man." Emily's expression softened. "A dance?" "No." William shook his head. "A reminder." For a moment neither moved. Then he extended his hand exactly as she had done months before. "May I?" Emily placed her hand in his. There was no music, but William led her through the first slow steps of a waltz anyway. "You are counting again," she said. "I am not." "You are. Perhaps I am trying to avoid stepping on you." A poor excuse for a duke who once terrified half of London with his dancing. William smiled openly this time. It transformed him more than Emily had expected, not because it erased the sorrow in his face, but because it proved sorrow had learned to share the space. Outside, the musicians began another melody, faint through the open terrace doors. William slowed. Once, music had reminded him only of what had ended. Now Emily stood before him, steady and unafraid, asking for nothing he had not freely chosen to give. "Emily," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes. Stay." It was not a command, not desperation, not a promise spoken before he understood its weight. It was simply the truth. Emily let the silence rest between them before answering. "I think I would like that." And as they continued beneath the candlelight, Ashford Hall did not feel rescued, nor did William. Some things were not meant to be rescued. Some hearts only needed one brave soul to remind them that they were still beating.